here. So hi everyone, it's really lovely that you're here. My name is Lisa Campbell. My background is in education. I worked as a SENCO, a special educational needs coordinator, and I've done that in primary schools and secondary schools. And then a couple of years ago, I started something called Wonderful Me, which is all about training and support and resources for local churches to help us create safe spaces that enable every child to feel seen, to feel heard, to feel valued, to flourish, which is a lot of what we've been talking about today. So we are going to jump in and talk a lot about, sorry, my thing has, there we go, and talk about trauma, a trauma-informed approach in our spaces. Just a bit of a heads up, I could do a day's training on this and we've got 40 minutes. So it's a little bit limited. We're going to rush through a whole load of stuff, but there's quite a lot on my website. So if you want to go deeper into anything, there's quite a lot of free resources on there. So do have a look. I love that our day is called Thriving Families, because that is what I'm all about. But actually, I think if we are really going to create spaces where families can thrive, it is really important that the spaces where those families are going to grow, the soil, which effectively is the space that we're creating, it's really important that that is good soil, that it's safe, and that we are creating spaces that are welcoming for families that come, but also are accessible, are engaging, are inclusive of them. So we're going to kind of spotlight on trauma today, which again is massive. So we're going to kind of whiz through, but I thought it'd be really helpful to just kind of think what we mean by the word trauma to start with. So there's a really lovely, really succinct, good definition of trauma that I came across by a lady called Shelley Rambo, who's a trauma theologian. And she just says that trauma is suffering that remains. So suffering that kind of affects in some significant way our emotional well-being, our physical bodies. We're going to look at how trauma has a physical effect on brain development, and kind of our central nervous system, our physical bodies. It's huge. So suffering that remains, but a really good definition, which was first coined by SAMHSA. So they're the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration. It's an American kind of government department. They came up with this really good definition that has kind of been adapted and adopted on a global space. So this is the definition that the kind of UK definition has been built around. In fact, I'm pretty sure the UK have just taken it and used it as is without even tweaking it. But basically, the SAMHSA definition of trauma says that it's individual trauma that results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has adverse lasting effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. It's quite a lot to sit with, and we could sit with that really for 40 minutes and unpack what it looks like and what it means. But effectively, we get the 3 E's of trauma from that. So it's an event that has taken place, but we know that lots of children experience adverse events in their lives. It's kind of a normal part of childhood. It's a part of life. But not all of those adverse events will go on to be a traumatic event that has a physical, an emotional, a social, a spiritual effect on them. So it can't just be about the event. So it is about the event, but it's also how that event is experienced by an individual. And we know there are loads of things that can affect how that event is experienced, not least the support mechanisms that are in place. We know that good, safe adults and supportive adults can mitigate the effects of trauma, which is incredible. So how it's experienced by them, but also then, does it have lasting and ongoing effects? So that's a super quick whiz through on what we're talking about when we talk about trauma. But what I really want to look at today, because what I want us to do is do some stuff that I feel is going to be useful, some practical things that we can pick up and that we can use. So we're going to use a tool that I've created called the trauma tree to really look at how we bring a trauma-informed approach within the spaces that we have. So what I'm hoping we will do is whiz through quite a bit of this. We're not going to get to unpack all of it, but we will hopefully sit with one or two bits and unpack it a bit more. And we're going to also have some chat, and we're going to share thoughts together. So be prepared for that. If things kind of you hear that occur to you and or make you think, or you want to bring a bit more wondering or curiosity to, make a note of them, and we'll have some points where we can really engage with each other and learn from each other, because I'm sure there is amazing experience and a wealth of wisdom in this space. So let's kind of learn from each other as we do that. So we are going to start off right at the bottom. And the thing that I often find when people are looking, usually I get churches where behavior has gone a bit crazy in one of the groups that they're running with children, and they come and go, oh, what do we do about this? And what I'm finding is, and it makes sense, because often we're overworked, overwhelmed, and we just want a quick fix. And it can be tempting to just jump straight to the what, the kind of top bit, the easy strategy that we can implement. And all of those are really important. And we're definitely going to unpack some of the what today. But actually, if we really want to have lasting effects and we want to really create safe spaces, we've got to go deeper than that. We've got to go back down to the roots, and we've got to identify our why. And then super importantly, we've then got to also think about our who is it that we're journeying with? What's going on for them? Do we understand the people that we're journeying with? Or do we just deliver a program regardless who's in front of us? And we've also got to think about our how. How are we going to deliver the lovely what, the strategies, the approach that we bring? So we kind of, if we can start and think right at the bottom at our roots, I really feel that that is the key to creating spaces where we can really, really flourish. So that's what we're going to do today. And we're going to start with the why. So I'm going to share a little bit of my why that kind of drew me into doing what I'm doing now. And hopefully some of it will resonate for you. But I'd really encourage you to spend some time at some point with your team, maybe just really remembering, first of all, your why. Why did you get into doing what you're doing in the first place? But also, what's important to you as a team? What is it that you're trying to achieve through this? Because if we can really discern our values and really explain our why, it really keeps us going when it gets tricky, apart from anything else. But it also really shapes what we do and how we do it. So my first why is some scary figures around trauma. And I should say, as we look at trauma, we are going to look at, there is a significant kind of some data around trauma and what that looks like in under fives, but also within the kind of under five stuff that you're doing, you're journeying with, you know, quite often whole families. And so those parents are going to be coming into your space, some of them carrying stories and life experiences, some of which are traumatic, that have shaped them, that have shaped the way they're going to be in your space, the way they're going to respond to other parents, the way they're going to respond to you, the way they may or may not build up trust. So kind of a lot of the trauma stuff, I'm going to couch it in a kind of child space, but the principles and the values and how it outworks kind of works with kids and with adults as well. So hold that in mind as we go through it. But this figure, I really find quite traumatic and I struggle with, because it says that 1 in 3 children and young people are exposed to at least one potentially traumatic event by the time that they're 18. But also in 2023, 1 in 5 children aged 8 to 16 had a probable mental health condition. But like I said, it's not just older children, because in 2017, the NHS did a piece of research. They'd not really looked at mental health in under fives before. And so they had a go. I can't anywhere find that they have redone that research. So, you know, tweaked it. So I'm kind of feeling maybe it was quite a tricky thing to do, to assess mental health in under fives. But what they found in 2017 was they thought that approximately 1 in 18 preschool children may have a mental health condition. Now, a huge part of that may be because over half of all parents, this is research done by UNICEF, over half of all parents in Britain with children under 5 struggle financially or with their own mental health. So when we look at some of those data things, and those are just a few, I think what we discover is that trauma is in our communities, it's in our families, it's certainly in our churches, it's on our doorsteps. And I guess the thing I struggle with is when churches approach me, often when I'm saying, well, maybe we could do a little bit of training with your team around trauma and understanding trauma, the response that I often get quite quickly is, oh, we don't have that here. And I think when we look at that data, I think you really know it's not true, especially when we add into that data the fact that we have all in the last 5 years lived through an international pandemic that certainly with under fives, I think we are starting to learn with older children, I think some of the impact of that pandemic and the trauma that has caused them and the effect that that has had on their emotional well-being, their mental well-being, their physical well-being and development. It's harder to identify with some of the older children, but it's certainly starting to bubble out, and we're seeing it. We're seeing it in the way they do friendships or don't, because they weren't in a space to learn to move from playing alongside to playing with, and all of the troubles that come with that as we wrestle with friendship and the trickiness and the problem solving. When they were isolated, they didn't have to do that. Or the effect it's had on their sensory well-being when they were isolated and in tiny bubbles and didn't have to be in the world, that it's so full of sensory impact. It's meant that their sensory systems are much more sensitive than they perhaps would have been pre-COVID in a child that age. So we are seeing the impact, but certainly with kind of younger children at the time, those differences were massive. I was working in a primary school just following COVID, and the number of children that arrived in reception still in nappies just jumped up beyond all recognition straight following COVID, as we just see the difference it has when children are in groups like the ones that you're running, or in nursery education, or you know, all that happens, and families that have their support network around them, all of those things. So I think it's really important that we recognize trauma exists. We are still seeing the impact, and it is definitely in our communities. And the thing is, if we ignore it, or just kind of say it's not here, and we don't really open our eyes and allow God to draw our attention to what's actually happening in our communities, we miss out on being able to join in and be part of God's story of healing and redemption. And there's a beautiful verse that is definitely part of my why in Isaiah 58, and it says, your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings. And literally, when I read that verse, everything in me just shouts out a massive, like, yes and amen. That is what I want to be part of, to rebuild ancient ruins, to kind of rebuild communities, the broken walls within our communities, the broken walls within our families. But if we're going to do that really, really well, we need to understand what it is we're doing, because actually, if we don't press in and understand trauma, at best, I think we risk missing out on the opportunities that there are for us to be those rebuilders and repairers. But at worst, we actually risk causing further damage because we don't understand, and we trigger or cause hurt by not journeying well in a safe way. So the other good kind of news around all of this is that, which in some ways just feels like the grace of God, that in some ways COVID happened when it did, because COVID happened after the last 10, 15 years of us learning more and more about how the brain works, that massive jump in our understanding, and a lot of what Sarah was drawing on earlier around brain development. We know that now because of new technology. So things like MRI scans. That means that we can see how the brain works. We better understand what is going on. We can understand development. And so we better understand now the effect that trauma has on the brain because we can see it. Now, that bit's not the good news, but the good news that we have discovered is something called brain plasticity. And brain plasticity basically has shown us that the brain has an incredible ability to change, to rebuild, and to heal. So yes, we know that trauma can have a negative effect on the physical development of a child's brain. or an adult's brain. We also know that that damage can be repaired. New synaptic connections can be made, new pathways can be built. And the way that happens is through positive relationships with safe caregivers or positive relationships with safe adults that are in your life, which I find incredible. And the buzzword for me of what I've heard this morning has just been the importance of relationships. We literally know that we are wired for connection. Our brains build through positive connection with safe caregivers in our lives, that sensory interaction, things like playing peekaboo and all of those things, that literally what helps our brains to build. But those relationships can also repair damage when there has been trauma in a child's life. So it's a good reminder that what we're doing in our groups, being those safe adults for families, is so valuable and so important. Like the science backs it up, that when you do relationship well and you create safe space in your groups, you're creating the opportunity for healing. But also, this is from a piece of research done by Young Minds. And they found that positive, safe relationships can also be a protective factor for a child in adversity. So we can be opportunities to rebuild and repair, but we also can be like that safety buffer with our kids when we build relationship well in our communities and we become extra safe adults in those kids' lives. We create opportunity to be buffers, to kind of stand around kids and literally champion, cheer them on, and be a safety and protection. So that's a little bit of my why. I could go on and on about my why because it's amazing. Like, I just find, I love that the science that we're learning literally backs up what we read in scripture. The Bible is just full of the importance of relationship. God is a God of relationship, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. The story of the cross is all about a restoration of relationship with us. And the science tells us relationship's important. It just backs up the things that we can learn about in scripture. And then the second part, which links really closely to our why, is understanding our who, and kind of understanding what trauma looks like, and how it can shape someone's character, how it can shape their understanding of the world, how it can shape the way they interact in relationships. And I came across a really lovely quote recently from a guy called Alasdair MacIntyre. And he says, I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part. So in your groups, as we're looking at shaping program and content and the way we do things, do we know the stories? Do we understand the people that we're journeying with? And as we understand those stories, that's what shapes how we do it and what we do. So there's 4 key things that come out of the same SAMHSA report. So they came up with 6 kind of key markers of what a trauma-informed approach looks like. I've kind of condensed them down to this 4, partly because I love a good acronym. So we're going for STEM. But actually, this is a kind of marker of how we understand how trauma has shaped people, and then how we use that to kind of inform our approach. So STEM stands for safe, trustworthy, empowering, and mutual. So safe is understanding that at the heart of trauma, it was about feeling not safe. So when we're looking at our safeguarding within our groups, which is so, so important, if people have experienced a world that is not safe, how much more important is it that we take our safeguarding well, that we ensure that the adults that are in our groups are super safe, because we're going to have people in our groups who've experienced what it's like to be around adults who aren't safe. And so it's super important that we make sure our safeguarding is spot on, is tight, because actually for me, safeguarding is like the heart of what Jesus is talking about when he's talking about building safe refuges. So, but also alongside the kind of almost what has been reduced at times to a hoop jump activity, that's safeguarding. We need to do that well, but we also need to think about felt safety. So what does it feel like in this space? So if you have got your, so with children, the example I often use is if you've got a group and we're all sat mixed in, if you've got a child who has experienced trauma, who doesn't always feel safe, and they're sat right at the front in a school environment. This really annoys me, because those kids that can be a little bit fizzy, who maybe are fizzy because their life experience has been really traumatic and difficult, they're the kids that the teacher often puts right at the front of the class so they can keep an eye on them. But actually, if you've experienced life not being safe, being in a room with a whole lot of people behind you that you can't see what they are doing, is not going to feel safe. So those kids often quite like to be near a wall, because then they can see what's in front of them and they can preempt the danger. So kind of thinking of things like this: how does this room feel? How does our welcome feel? Do people know where they're going to go? Do people know what's coming next? How do we really prioritize felt safety? And then trustworthy is understanding that, again, if you've experienced trauma, you've experienced and learned that people can't always be trusted. The world is not a safe space and people can't be trusted. So to earn trust in people who've learned that people can't be trusted, it's not safe to trust, is really, really tricky. But those people are often really, really good at reading faces, because every part of their survival has depended on them identifying whether something is safe or not. So it's really important that we are calm and that we bring genuine care. People who've experienced trauma will very, very quickly identify someone who is on a team because they feel it's their duty, and they're not really that bothered. So that genuine care, so that we can really build trust. And if we say we're going to do something, we do it, because it's super important. Lots of us know that things happen and life is really tricky. And sometimes people say they'll do something and it doesn't always happen. But if you've experienced trauma and you've learned that people can't be trusted, that is going to have a massive knock on how you can trust people. So if we say we're going to do something, it's super important we do it. And then empowering. Again, a huge part of trauma often means that in the space where that traumatic event was happening or events were happening, you lost the ability to be in control of what was happening. Something was happening to you and there was nothing you could do about it. And so often we find in children and in adults that have experienced trauma, there's often a lot of behaviour that's around gaining control. And that makes sense when we remember actually they've lost control and that caused them to be damaged and hurt. So we need to kind of anticipate that and preempt it. And so voice and choice is a really good thing to remember in that space. Do we make space for people to have a voice? Do we just do things to people, or do we empower them? Do we give them a voice? But also, do we give them choice? With children, that's quite important. Kind of older children, we often have quite fixed programs in our kids ministry. And we're going to do story time and then we're going to do this. And that's it. You do it because that's what we're going to do. But actually often building choice of, if you're going to find that game really tricky and really, really noisy, then you could sit and do some quiet colouring or wherever that looks like, but creating choice so that people don't feel that they're being forced to do something, but empowering is really helpful. And then finally, mutual. This phrase is a phrase that is often thrown around in kind of SEND work, working with kids with additional needs and their families. But it just is a really good thing to remember with any child or family. Nothing about me without me. It often comes from a really good place where people are making choices and thoughts and trying to preempt the needs of families and what might be helpful and supportive. And that's a good thing that we begin to think like that. But let's do that in an empowering way that involves our families and journeys with them. So nothing about me without me. How do we make decisions and journey with them together? So we're going to pause for the first time there. I love to do a little bit of a wonder moment. So I love wonder. It's a beautiful thing, and there's lots of different types of wonder. So one way we can wonder is to wonder like, I wonder how that works. So any questions that are whizzing around or thoughts that you're like, I need to think on that more. And then the other kind of wonder we can have is to be like in wonder, like, whoa, that's cool. So we're going to pause for a wonder moment, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see more of your faces. That's better. And we'll have a wonder moment. So any questions that you've got or any things that have stood out that you're like, oh, that's good, I need to remember that. Over to you. And I am a teacher, so when people don't join in, I do sometimes go back to just using people's names. But I'll leave it to you first.
I was just sort of wondering, like how you can, like, are there any like telltale signs that somebody has suffered trauma? Because, so I used to work for a food bank, and I did like this trauma course, and is it the ACEs? I can't remember what it stands for.
Yeah.
Had a baby.
Adverse childhood experiences. Yeah.
There we go. I did a test on that, and it came back that I had a few, and I was like, oh, okay. um, so then I was like, oh, so I don't think I would recognize it in me. So, but I know there's like, I'm working with a few children, and there's been a couple of things where I've been like, okay, we need to, but is there any sort of, I don't know.
Yeah. So there's a few things in that, Bryony. It's a good question. So the ACEs is a really good tool, and in Scotland particularly, they really pressed into it and took it really, really seriously. And I think the reason it's a good tool is it helps us bring curiosity and means that we are open to the possibility of how things that have happened in kids' childhood can shape their experience of life, their development, how they journey through the rest of their lives, all of those things. But you're right. So it stands for adverse childhood experience. But like we saw in that trauma clip, or that trauma quote rather, so that is kind of the event, really. ACEs looks at an event, but trauma and the effect it has involves the effect it has and how it's experienced. So, like you were saying, oh, I had quite a few ACEs, but I think if you were traumatized by them, you might be a little bit more aware of it. So it's kind of holding those two. So that's a good point for us to think about. But the other thing to think about is, I think, in some ways, what we're going to go on to in a minute for the last 10 minutes is to look at some of the kind of ways and strategies that we can journey it that means we help create safe spaces. So I think a lot of trauma is hidden, and we are not always going to know about it. But what we can do is be ready and create safe spaces and bring safe approaches. And all of the stuff that works really well for kids and families that have experienced trauma works really well for kids and families, full stop. It just is super important if you've got families that have experienced trauma. So if we can create approaches and create spaces that are safe, it just means that should trauma be present, whether we're aware of it or not, it means that we're in a better place to journey it well. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So in some ways, we don't even need to know. We just need to be aware that it's a possibility. Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts or questions?
Lisa, one of my thoughts right from the get-go was that first slide. 1 in 3 children are exposed to at least one potentially traumatic event by the time they're 18. Only one? I mean, I'm gobsmacked that it's only one.
Yeah, and it's at least one. Do you mean only 1 in 3, or at least, or the event?
The event is
it's at least one, isn't it? But yeah,
I mean, that seems really low. I would have said double figures.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, yeah, and there are others. I've tried to keep you a bit more like under 5e in my head, but there's the other fact around kids that have experienced a form of abuse is really high as well. So you kind of got to put all of those data things together, and effectively we're just trying to remember that it exists. But you're right, it's much higher. But for some people, like the people who I frequently have conversations that are like, trauma doesn't exist, it's just like no, it really does.
Yeah.
Cool. Any other thoughts or questions?
Yeah, I was thinking, Lisa, we are so insistent that children are resilient, that they can cope with anything. It's like, oh, yeah, doesn't forget that, they're resilient. And we've heard it, everybody says it. Children are resilient, they'll forget. But they don't, do they? Because if they did, why do we have so many broken adults and, we do a lot of, if I do a lot of prayer ministry, and people who need, adults who need prayer, as well as, you know, younger people as well. But children aren't resilient, and I think if we can tend to, you know, just move away from that thought, or help people to move away from that thought, that would be helpful.
And there's a few things, isn't there? There's like, I think children can be resilient, but we're all different. And so it's the thought that children should be resilient.
Yeah.
Well, no, but also it's us having a better understanding of trauma.
Yeah.
So, I mean, a lot of this learning has come out over the last 10, 20 years. Our understanding of trauma has really, really grown. And so, you know, even within I don't think I'm massively old. I'm heading towards 50, but I'm not massively old. But within my teaching career, I remember journeying with families myself, and I look back now and think, oh my goodness, like I really wish I'd known this stuff back then. But kids that had been adopted at birth, who were from incredibly challenging family backgrounds, but they'd been adopted by birth, and part of me couldn't understand why all of this wraparound care needed to be put in place for kids that were adopted by birth and had been in safe families for their whole child existence. And at the time I was in secondary schools, so they were 11, 12, 13. But our understanding now and our knowledge that actually trauma before kids are born, so in utero trauma, that experience can shape brain development in babies and can go on to have lasting effects on how kids' brains work, how they interact with the world, how they understand. So yeah, it's that understanding that and I think we do it all the time with kids in primary schools. They can be living in horrific environments and they're expected to come into school and just be able to learn. But yeah, we definitely need to grow. Right, we're going to jump on because we've got like, oh my goodness, 9 minutes. So let me re-share. And I think annoyingly, my keynote has disappeared. So let me reopen it. Hang on, bear with me. There we go. Right. Let me share now. I've completely lost the ability to share. There we go. Got it. Sorry. Okay. Have we got that? Great. I can see your nods. Okay. So we've looked at the why, we've looked at the who. I'm really gutted. We've got 9 minutes. What I'd really love to do is the why, because for me, that's the bit that everyone skips over. But we can have, as leaders of our groups, really good ideas of what we want to achieve. We can understand our why. We can have a good understanding of trauma, and we can create approaches and use tools and programs that are really trauma informed and lovely and inclusive and safe. But if we don't then talk with our teams around the how we're going to do that, it can all fall apart when you have one leader that bustles into with older kids that shouts at them because they're kicking a ball against the wall. Like we really need to look at the how of what we're delivering as well as the what of what we're delivering. So if you want to look at that a little bit more, there's some stuff on my website about PACE, which is a really good tool. But that in and of itself is a 2-hour session. So we're going to skip over it and we're going to get to the what. So we've all got some practical tools to leave with. So the what is looking at our space and it's looking at the tools that we use. And a really helpful tool that I'm going to proper whiz through is something called the Stars of Safety. Again, there's a free copy of this tool on the website. And so it starts with S for structure. So, and this works at every age. So we have programs, we have ways of working within our under fives ministry. Do the adults that come to your space understand what the structure looks like? Do they know what's coming next? Because actually, if you've experienced trauma, coming into a space where you don't know how it works and you don't know what is going to happen next can feel really, really scary. And so bringing clarity around what we are doing with kids ministry, it's really helpful to have a visual timetable. But even in under fives ministry for your adults, having something that's really visible about this is where this table is, this is where our messy play is, this is where free play is, this is how we get coffee and when coffee happens. All of those things, being really clear around your structure can really help people to feel safe. And then the T is for transition. So if you have a program where you're moving from one to the other, the video that we had that free play, didn't it? And then it moved into, we're going to ring a bell. That bell was great because it signifies for the families, this is when we're going to move. But to make that even better, how do you give a warning to that so that people can begin to get their head around this is what's going to come next? So be clear around what you're going to do, but be also clear around how you're going to change from one to the other. So you're not just expecting people to switch off from one thing to the other and move really quickly. So transition. A is an anchor. Now this can look like lots of different things for lots of different places for lots of different people. So examples of an anchor might be that you have the same person on your welcome desk. So for families coming in, they always see a friendly face that anchors them in that space, and they know that they're going to be welcomed. For kids groups, it might be that you try and keep your structure of the room similar, or it might be that you try and keep the same small groups of children if you do small group work with older children, or it might be that you always have coffee. I was speaking to an adult with ADHD recently, and she was like, do you know what, I find church much easier if I could just have a cup of tea in my hand, and that would help me settle. Because that's like an anchor for her that just helps her be anchored in the space and feel like it's safe. So how do we help people anchor in their space and feel safe and know what's coming? But people are a great anchor for that. And then routine. Routine is a really funny one that I think is a problem for adults and less of a problem for kids. And I think if you're doing kids ministry with other adults in the room, I imagine it might even feel more of an issue, because we have a thing that, man, if we just do the same every week, people are going to think we're rubbish and don't know what we're doing. We always need to be innovative and do the new thing. And part of that is trying to prove our own worth. But if we can kind of hold that, see it for what it is, and actually choose to bring an approach that actually is about safety rather than whether we feel like we're approved or not. Because routine is really valued. It's certainly valued by children. Kids are like creatures of habit. They love to do the same things week in, week out, and that can really help them feel safe. And it's nice to ring the bells and ring the changes every now and again in a clear way. But don't be frightened of routine, because that can be a really good way of helping someone feel safe. And then the last one, which again, we could talk about forever. And this is a whole day's training just on this one tool that I offer. And that's around thinking about sensory awareness. So we know that trauma has an impact on brain development that can continue through to adulthood. But certainly is an issue for children around the impacts that it has on their developing brains and their sensory systems. And so lots of children and adults that have experienced trauma can be more sensitive to sensory input. So busy spaces, have you got a quiet space that people can sit to, or lots of flashy lights? So think through. I mean, in the sensory training day, we look at how we have more than 5 senses, but let's start with the 5 main ones and think through in your space, what does that look like? What does the input look like in each of those things? And try and notice the things that we normally miss. So whirry lights, or a fan of air conditioning that is kind of whizzing. We might filter that out, but if you struggle with sensory input, that your attention is going to be drawn full to that. If you've got a flickery light, it's annoying for us. For other people who've experienced trauma, it will be unavoidable. So thinking through the sensory input. Oh, man, so sorry. That's a lot more of me talking than I intended. We've got 1 minute. Any thoughts on styles of safety? I will put in the chat when we go back my contact details, so feel free to get in touch. Any questions or thoughts, or I'm always up for a virtual coffee to talk about this stuff with anyone that is passionate about it. So if you just kind of have a bit of a thing that you want to explore in a little bit more detail, then get in touch. But I've thrown a lot at you, and it's hard to really unpick it and sit with it in the moment.
Can I just add something? Have we got a minute?
Yes, please do.
I'm very reluctant to start talking because, as Sally knows, because I work with Sally, I'm an adoptive mum to 2 very complex, traumatised children. So we're on the other end of the scale, but everything you've said is valid, and I can recognise how all of that would make a huge, huge difference.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks for sharing that. And how much more important is it when we've got children in our churches who've experienced trauma beyond anything most of us could even begin to imagine, and we know that there are families that are journeying that day in, day out, how much more important that in our churches we create spaces where we stand with those adults, a little bit like Aaron stood with Moses and held his hands up, that we bring safe spaces. That means we stand with parents like Michelle and cheer her on and champion her, and don't stuff it up by creating spaces that just add to the trauma.
But you wouldn't come because you couldn't come.
Yeah.
That would be the decision you'd make. You wouldn't be able to bring your children.
Thank you.